A polar bear's last hope. You won't believe who came to help. The Arctic stretched endlessly before Ranger Logan Hayes, a frozen wasteland of blinding white and relentless wind. The early morning sun was barely a pale glow on the horizon, struggling to pierce through the thick cloud cover. The temperature had plunged overnight, the kind of cold that seeped into bones, turning breath into icy vapor that hung in the air like ghostly whispers. Logan pulled his thermal mask higher over his face, adjusting the fur-lined hood of his parka as he navigated the treacherous snowdrifts. His patrol today was routine, or so he thought. As a wildlife ranger assigned to one of the most remote Arctic reserves, his job was to monitor the land, ensuring no illegal activity threatened the fragile ecosystem. Then the sound came. A sharp, desperate cry. Logan froze. It cut through. The wind like a knife, high-pitched, pained, and filled with unmistakable distress. It wasn't the wail of the wind or the distant crack of shifting ice. This was something alive. Something in trouble. He instinctively reached for his binoculars, scanning the vast stretch of ice ahead. Nothing but endless white. His heart began to pound. He had spent years in the Arctic. He knew that sound. A young animal, possibly a cub, calling for its mother. Without hesitation, Logan picked up his pace, his boots crunching over the frozen ground. The sound was growing fainter. Whatever it was losing strength. After what felt like an eternity of trudging through the deep snow, he reached the edge of a partially frozen river. The ice cracked ominously beneath his weight as he stepped forward cautiously. His breath hitched as his eyes locked onto the scene below. A polar bear cub, small, barely a few months old, was trapped in a deep, ice-covered pit. Its tiny paws scrambled weakly against the slick walls, but the ice was too steep, too smooth. It had no way out. The cub's fur was stiff with frost, its breath shallow. Logan could see the exhaustion in its trembling body, the way its movements were slowing. It was freezing to death, but as Logan took another step forward, his gaze shifted, and his blood ran cold. Not far from the pit, the mother bear lay trapped in a steel snare. Her massive white form contrasted sharply against the ice, her muscles tensed as she fought against the cruel metal wires coiled around her front paw. Blood stained the snow beneath her. The more she struggled, the tighter the snare dug into her flesh. Her deep, labored breaths sent puffs of mist into the freezing air, but it was her eyes that struck Logan the hardest, desperate, helpless. She wasn't fighting for herself. She was watching her cub. Logan clenched his jaw, fury boiling inside him. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate trap. His eyes scanned the area. The snare wasn't old. The steel glinted, freshly set. The walls of the cub's pit weren't natural either. They had been carved, intentionally smoothed to prevent escape. Poachers. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Someone had set this up. And judging by the state of the trap, whoever had done this could be coming back soon. Logan exhaled sharply, forcing his racing mind to focus. The cub first. It was weaker, and if it didn't get warmth soon, it wouldn't survive. He crouched at the edge of the pit, unfastening his backpack. His fingers, despite being wrapped in insulated gloves, felt stiff from the bitter cold. He pulled out a coil of climbing rope, securing one end to a nearby ice outcrop. He had to be careful. The cub was weak, and any sudden movement could send it into full panic mode. His first attempt to lower the loop failed. The rope slid uselessly against the frozen walls. The cub whimpered, barely reacting. Logan's chest tightened. It's too cold. It's already shutting down. He tried again. This time the rope brushed against the cub's side. A small, sluggish twitch, its last bit of fight. Come on, little one. Hold on. On the third try, he managed to secure the loop around the cub's torso. Logan took a steadying breath and began pulling. Every movement had to be slow, controlled. The icy edges of the pit could easily cut into the cub's already fragile body. His arms burned with the strain, the frost biting through his gloves. The cub was barely moving now. Its head lolled slightly, its breathing dangerously shallow. Just a little more. With one final pull, the cub's frozen body emerged from the pit. Logan immediately wrapped it in a thermal rescue blanket, cradling its trembling form against his chest. But there was no time to rest. He turned toward the mother bear. She had been watching the entire time, her massive body motionless, her wounded paw still caught in the steel trap. But now her breathing had changed, less frantic, more focused. She knew he was trying to help. Logan slowly approached, his hands steady but his mind racing. The snare was thick, expertly set. This wasn't some careless poacher's trap. This was designed to hold something as powerful as a polar bear. He knelt beside her, pulling out his multi-tool. His fingers were shaking, both from the cold and the sheer tension of being inches away from one of the Arctic's most formidable predators. The steel cables were dug deep into her paw, her white fur matted with dark, frozen blood. Logan worked quickly, trying to release the first clasp. His breath caught as the wind shifted. A distant sound, a low, mechanical hum. Logan's pulse spiked. Snowmobiles. The poachers were coming back. He had only minutes. Logan's breath came out in quick, misty puffs as he crouched beside the polar bear cub. The bitter Arctic wind cut through his insulated jacket, biting at his exposed skin. The snowfall was getting heavier, blanketing the cub's tiny, trembling form. Its once bright fur was stiff with frost, tiny icicles forming along the edges, where the snow had settled. It was fading. Logan placed a gloved hand gently on the cub's side. Shallow breaths, slow, too slow. The tiny rise and fall of its ribs were barely visible beneath its thick coat. He didn't have long. He reached into his pack, his numb fingers fumbling as he yanked out a climbing rope and carabiners. Years of Arctic training had drilled these movements into his muscle memory, but the brutal cold made everything sluggish. He fastened one end of the rope around a thick, ice-covered outcrop, giving it a firm tug to test its hold. Then he fashioned a loop at the other end, carefully lowering it down to the cub. The first attempt failed. The rope slid uselessly against the cub's frozen fur. The little one barely reacted, only shifting slightly at the contact. Logan gritted his teeth. He couldn't afford to panic. He adjusted the loop, trying again. This time, the rope touched the cub's front legs, but as he gently pulled, the slick ice made it slip away again. His heart pounded against his ribs. Every second wasted was another second closer to death. Logan exhaled sharply, calming his racing thoughts. He widened the loop and tried once more, maneuvering the rope so it settled just beneath the cub's belly. A faint twitch. Then, finally, as he tightened the loop, the cub's tiny weight shifted. Got it. With slow, controlled movements, Logan began pulling. He had to be careful. Too much force could injure the cub, too little and it would slip again. His arms burned from the effort, his gloves damp with melting ice. Inch by inch the cub rose. Then, a sound. A deep, low hum. Logan's body stiffened. At first it was barely audible over the howling wind, but as he strained his ears, the unmistakable sound of approaching snowmobiles sent a bolt of adrenaline through him. The poachers. They were coming back. His mind raced. If they found him here, they wouldn't hesitate. He had just ruined their catch. He turned his attention back to the cub, only a few more inches. He clenched his jaw, pulling faster now, his breath ragged from both effort and urgency. The cub's head surfaced first, its small, black eyes barely open. Its body trembled violently as it reached the edge, its legs too weak to help itself up. Logan didn't think. He dropped to his knees and scooped the cub into his arms. The little body was ice cold. Holding the cub close, he grabbed a thermal rescue blanket from his pack. The fabric crackled as he wrapped it tightly around the cub's frail form, sealing in whatever heat was left. The hum of the snowmobiles was closer now. Logan's eyes darted around, scanning the landscape. He couldn't risk running. The open tundra offered no cover. He needed to hide the cub somewhere safe, somewhere the poachers wouldn't immediately find it. His gaze locked onto a large snowbank, thick and solid from months of frozen buildup. Without hesitation, he scrambled toward it, digging frantically through the packed snow with his bare hands. His fingers throbbed as they scraped against ice, but he didn't stop. Within moments, he had created a small, insulated hollow. He placed the cub inside, ensuring the blanket covered it completely. It barely moved, its tiny chest rising and falling in weak, shallow breaths. Logan pressed a hand to its head. "Stay with me, little one," he whispered, his voice barely audible against the wind. Then he turned toward the mother. She was watching. Him. Her dark eyes locked onto his, her massive body still restrained by the steel snare. Blood stained the ice beneath her injured paw, but she didn't thrash or struggle. She understood. Logan could almost feel it, the silent trust between them. But trust wouldn't save them. Not yet. The snowmobiles were near. He could hear, voices now muffled through the storm, but clear enough to recognize the sharp, clipped tones of men giving orders. Logan took a deep breath. He wasn't leaving without the mother. Ignoring the biting pain in his fingers, he knelt beside the steel snare, pulling out his multi-tool. His hands trembled from the cold as he worked, the delicate mechanisms barely visible beneath layers of frost. The first clasp was stubborn. It refused to budge, the freezing metal biting into his fingertips even through his gloves. The voices were louder. His pulse raced. If they saw him, if they caught him, no. He couldn't think about that. Focus. He adjusted his grip and twisted the tool, forcing the first clasp loose. 1 down, 2 to go. The snow crunched behind him. Logan's breath caught. They were here seconds, that's all he had. He turned back to the lock, his fingers moving faster than they ever had before. Say, shout. Someone had spotted the trap. Logan's heart pounded in his ears as he worked on the second clasp, sweat freezing on his skin despite the cold. His mind screamed at him to hurry, hurry, hurry. Another shout. Footsteps. The second. Clasp came loose. Just one more. One of the poachers stepped forward. Hey! Someone's here. The final clasp. Logan forced the tool into the last mechanism, his hands barely responding to his commands. The poacher raised his rifle. Stop right there. Logan's fingers found the release. Click. The steel snare snapped. Open. For a moment, everything was still. Then the mother bear moved. With a low, rumbling growl, she rose to her full height, her immense form blocking Logan from view. The poachers hesitated. Logan didn't wait. Heart hammering, he vanished into the blizzard. The battle wasn't over yet. The howling wind carried a deadly chill, but Logan barely noticed the cold anymore. His hands moved on instinct, securing the last fold of the thermal rescue blanket around the shivering polar bear cub. The tiny creature barely stirred, its frozen body tucked safely within the snowy hollow. He gave the cub one final glance before turning back to the mother. She lay still, her massive form half buried in the drifting snow, but her labored breaths sent mist curling into the freezing air. The steel snare was still wrapped around her paw, cutting deep into the flesh. Blood stained the ice beneath her, a stark contrast against the pure white snow. Logan dropped to his knees beside her, his multi-tool already in his gloved hands. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the biting cold and the urgency, pressing down on him. Every second counted. The lock was intricate, designed to be tamper-proof. This wasn't just any makeshift trap. It was professional work. Whoever had set it up had done so knowing a full-grown polar bear would fight to escape. He wedged the tip of his tool into the first latch, twisting gently. The cold had made the mechanism stiff, and his numb fingers fumbled as he worked. A sharp click, one clasp undone. Logan exhaled, his breath clouding the air. He shifted, reaching for the second lock. Then a sound, low at first, barely distinguishable beneath the wind. Then closer. Logan's blood ran cold. Engines, the distant hum of snowmobiles. He stopped, his entire body tensing. The wind was picking up, but there was no mistaking it now. The mechanical growl of approaching snowmobiles cut through the Arctic silence. They were coming. Logan swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. He turned his attention back to the steel snare, forcing himself to focus. He could still get the mother out. He just needed more time. A sharp gust of wind carried something new. Voices. too late. From the swirling storm, 3 dark figures emerged. They stepped into view, silhouettes against the blinding white. Men. Armed. Poachers. The leader, tall, broad-shouldered, a long scar running across his cheek, stopped first, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. His expression twisted into pure fury as he spotted the empty trap. The cub was gone. His hands clenched into fists. "Someone's been here," he growled, his voice cutting through the wind. One of the others, a shorter man with a heavy fur-lined coat, took a cautious step forward. His boots crunched against the ice as his gaze landed on Logan. There was no hesitation. He raised his rifle, aimed directly at Logan. The world seemed to slow. Logan's fingers tightened around his multi-tool, but he forced himself to stay. Still. No sudden movements. The man's gloved hands were steady, his finger hovering over the trigger. The leader took a slow step forward, his scarred face unreadable. His piercing gaze flicked between the mother bear, the open trap, and the scattered tools in Logan's hands. "You made a mistake," the leader said coldly. Logan didn't answer. The poacher let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" He gestured toward the mother bear, still trapped but watching everything with dark, unblinking eyes. "You think you're saving her?" he sneered. "She's worth more than your entire goddamn life." Logan's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what this was about. Polar bears were valuable. Their fur, their claws, even their bones could fetch thousands on the black market. And a trapped mother, that was an easy target. Logan kept his voice steady. "Let her go," the leader laughed, a short, cruel sound. "Let her go." He turned to the man holding the rifle. "Hear that? He thinks he gets to make demands." The gunman smirked. Logan's mind raced. 3 men, at least 2 armed. He had nothing but a multi-tool and a cub hidden in a snowbank. The odds were against him. He needed to stall. "You can't take her," Logan said, keeping his tone firm. "She's injured. She won't survive transport." The leader's eyes darkened. "Not your problem." Logan took a slow step back, closer to the mother bear. "You don't understand," he said. "She's—" A sudden growl rumbled behind him. Low. Deep. The leader's expression faltered. The mother bear had moved. Not much, just a small shift of her massive weight, but it was enough. The tension in her muscles was different now. Not struggling, not scared, waiting. Logan saw it before the poachers did. The shift in her breathing. The way her eyes locked onto the men. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was calculating. The scarred leader let out a frustrated sigh. "Enough talking?" He lifted his gloved hand, signaling the man with the gun. "Get rid of him." The rifleman adjusted his aim. Logan's breath hitched. Then, a gust of wind, a blur of white, and a sound like thunder. The mother bear moved. 1 second, she was still bound by the snare. The next, she lunged. The steel trap snapped apart, shattered beneath her sheer strength. Her deafening roar tore through the Arctic, so loud it drowned out the storm. Logan didn't stop to think. The moment the men staggered back, their guns swinging wildly, he dropped low and ran, straight into the blizzard. Behind him, the mother. Bear charged. A gunshot rang out. Then another. But it was chaos now. The storm swallowed everything. The bear's growls, the men's shouts, the sharp sound of boots scrambling across the ice. Logan didn't stop. His heartbeat thundered in. His ears, his lungs burning as he pushed forward deeper into the storm. He didn't dare look back, because he already knew. The fight had begun, and the poachers had no idea what they were up against. Logan's breath came in ragged gasps, misting in the freezing air as his fingers worked frantically on the lock. The biting cold had already numbed his hands, making every movement slower, more difficult, but he didn't have time to stop. The poachers were closing in. Boots crunched through the snow, drawing closer with every second. He could hear them, low. Voices clipped orders, the metallic click of a rifle being readied. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then, a gust of wind howled through the frozen wilderness. A veil of snow lifted from the ground, swirling violently between him and the approaching figures. For a split second, Everything disappeared in a blinding white haze. Logan didn't waste the opportunity. Click. The lock snapped open. The steel snare unraveled from the mother bear's injured paw. She was free. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then she moved. A deep, thunderous growl rumbled through her massive chest as she rose to her full height. Her hulking form, covered in thick white fur, towered over the landscape like a creature born from the storm itself. The poachers froze. The wind screamed around them, but for a moment there was no sound, just the deadly, piercing gaze of a mother who had been wronged. Her golden eyes burned with unrestrained fury. The leader, the man with the scar, was the first to react. His breath hitched, but he quickly lifted his rifle, stepping back. "Hold your ground," he barked, voice shaking slightly. The second poacher fumbled with his gun, his hands trembling. "So shoot it!" But they hesitated, because they knew. They were facing something beyond their control. The mother bear snarled. Her muscles coiled, her powerful limbs tensing to strike. And then she charged. The storm erupted with the roar of a beast who had nothing left to lose. Snow exploded beneath her massive paws as she lunged forward, her sheer weight shaking the icy ground. The scarred leader stumbled back. "Shoot!" he shouted, raising his rifle. A deafening gunshot split the air. Logan didn't wait to see if it hit. He ran. Ducking low, he vanished into the blizzard, moving as fast as his frozen limbs would carry him. The wind clawed at his face, blurring his vision, but he knew the landscape well enough. He had to get to the cub. Behind him, chaos erupted. The poachers screamed. Another gunshot, then a sharp, blood-curdling yell. Logan kept running. His boots pounded against the ice, his breath ragged. The mother bear's roars mixed with the howling storm, her fury shaking the very air around them. Then a sickening crunch, a snap of bone, a final broken scream. Then silence. Logan didn't stop. The cub. That was all that mattered now. Through the blinding snow, he spotted the snowbank where he had hidden it. His chest burned as he pushed forward, his legs threatening to give out. He dropped to his knees, hands scrambling through the snow, until he felt the soft fur beneath the blanket. The cub was still breathing. A wave of relief crashed over him. But he wasn't safe yet. He turned, peering back through the storm. In the distance, the mother bear stood alone. The poachers were gone. Blood stained the ice where they had stood, their weapons scattered and abandoned. The leader's rifle lay half buried in the snow, its barrel bent from the impact of the attack. The mother bear's breathing was heavy, her injured paw barely supporting her weight. But she wasn't looking at the aftermath of the fight. She was looking at Logan. For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm raged around them, but Logan felt a stillness settle between them. Then, slowly, painfully, the mother bear turned. She limped toward the snowbank, toward her cub. Logan stepped back. He knew he had to let them be. The mother reached down, her massive jaws gently lifting the tiny, trembling cub. A low, guttural sound rumbled from her chest, a soft, reassuring hum. Logan felt a lump form in his throat. The cub was safe. Mother bear looked at him one last time. There was no fear in her eyes, no anger, just understanding. Then she turned and disappeared into the storm, her cub cradled safely against her. Logan watched until their massive forms faded into the white void. Only then did he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They were free. And for the first time that night, Logan allowed himself to believe so was he. Logan stood motionless as he watched the mother bear gently lift her cub in her powerful jaws, cradling it against her chest. The little one barely stirred, exhausted but alive. Snow swirled around them, the Arctic wind howling through the frozen landscape, yet in that moment, everything felt still. She hesitated for a brief second, her dark eyes locking onto Logan's from across the icy expanse. A silent understanding passed between them. Then, without another glance, she turned and disappeared into the wilderness, her massive form blending into the storm. They were safe. But Logan knew he wasn't. Days, Passed. The blizzard eventually cleared, leaving behind a frozen, glistening wasteland. But the unease in Logan's chest never faded. At first, it was just a feeling, an instinct, honed from years of surviving in these harsh conditions. The sense that he was being watched. Then came the tracks. Faint at first, a set of snowmobile trails cutting through areas of the reserve where no one should be. Logan found them just outside his usual patrol route, perfectly positioned to observe his movements. The realization hit him like ice water down his spine. The poachers weren't gone. They were waiting, watching, planning. Then came the footprints. 1. Evening, as the sky darkened into a deep Arctic blue, Logan returned to his small outpost, a single wooden cabin nestled against a ridge of ice. As he approached, something felt off. The air was too still, and then he saw them. Fresh footprints in the snow. Not his. Logan's stomach twisted. His hand went instinctively to his radio, clipped to his belt. He needed to report this, now. But the moment his fingers brushed the device, the first gunshot shattered the silence. Logan barely had time to react. The shot wasn't aimed to kill, it was a warning. Then, before he could move, something hit him from behind. A heavy force slammed into him, knocking him forward. His knees crashed into the frozen ground, pain jolting up his legs. He struggled, but rough hands grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back. A thick rope bit into his wrists, yanking them together with brutal force. He thrashed, kicking at the snow, but a boot pressed into his shoulder, pinning him down. "Not so fast, Ranger." The voice was cold, familiar. Logan gritted his teeth. As he was hauled roughly to his feet, snow stung his face as he was turned around, coming face to face with the scarred leader. The man looked worse than before. His coat was torn. A deep scratch ran down his cheek, a fresh wound. From the bear. His gray eyes burned with rage. "You should have stayed out of this," he said, voice low and controlled. "You cost me a lot that night." Logan's pulse pounded. His eyes darted to the other 2 poachers, both standing nearby, one holding a rifle, the other gripping a length of rope. They were prepared this time. "You're not walking away again," the leader continued. "No bear to save you now." Then the wind shifted. A deep, low growl rumbled through the snowstorm. It wasn't the wind. The poachers froze. Logan barely had time to process it before a massive shape emerged from the white void. His heart stopped. Her, the mother bear. She moved like a ghost through the storm, her white fur blending seamlessly with the snow. But there was no mistaking her presence. Her golden eyes locked onto the poachers, and she wasn't alone. Behind her, 2 more massive figures appeared, adult polar bears, their thick bodies moving in unison with hers. Logan had no idea where they had come from. If they were part of her family, or simply other bears drawn by the scent of blood, fear, and weakness. But it didn't matter, because the poachers saw them too. The rifleman panicked first. "Holy," he fumbled with his gun, raising it too. "Past." His hands shook. The mother bear's growl deepened. Then she charged. The snow exploded beneath her powerful paws. The second bear followed. The leader's face twisted in panic. "Run!" It was too late. The mother bear was on them. One of the poachers tried to fire, but his gloves fumbled with the trigger. The first bear lunged. The rifleman screamed as a wall of fur and muscle crashed into him, sending him sprawling into the snow. His gun skidded away, disappearing beneath the ice. The second poacher turned to flee, but the third bear blocked his path. A swipe of a massive paw, a snap of bone. He collapsed, gasping in the snow. The leader tried to run. But the mother bear was faster. She caught him in seconds. A roar ripped through the air as she reared up on her hind legs, her full 9-foot frame towering over him. The scarred man fell backward, scrambling through the snow. "No! Oh, please!" The bear slammed her paw down. The ice shuddered. Logan didn't see what happened next, because he was already moving. The moment the poachers were down, Logan twisted his wrists, ignoring the pain as he worked the ropes loose. His fingers were frozen, his body weak, but adrenaline kept him moving. The rope finally gave way. He fell forward, barely catching himself in the snow. The bears were still there, but they weren't looking at him. They were watching the poachers. Logan slowly pushed himself to his feet. His gaze met the mother bear's. For the second time, she had saved his life. He didn't know if she recognized him, if she remembered. But in that moment, it didn't matter. She turned away first. One by one, the bears vanished into the snowstorm. Logan watched them go. Then, without another glance at the men behind him, he disappeared into the Arctic night. This time, he didn't look back.